Alright, let's get one thing straight before we dive in. We're not talking about some fairy tale castle with silk curtains, warm fireplaces in every room, and servants bringing you hot soup on a silver tray. Nope. We're talking about a real stone-cold, bone-chilling medieval castle in the year 1348. And trust me, if you think your apartment gets cold in winter, you haven't seen anything yet. So buckle up, because we're going back in time. And you might want to grab a blanket before we start. The year is 1348. Europe is not having a good time, to put it mildly. The Black Death, one of the deadliest events in all of human history, is tearing across the continent like a wildfire nobody can put out. Entire villages going silent overnight, cities emptying out. And people everywhere are doing what people always do when they're terrified and have no answers. They're praying, they're running, and they're pointing fingers. Now, you might think that living in a castle meant you were safe. Big walls, armed guards, your own food supply. Surely that counted for something, right? Well, yes and no. And that's exactly what we're going to dig into today. Dawn breaks, and nobody is sleeping in. The sun has barely cracked the horizon when life inside the castle walls is already in full swing. Forget sleeping past sunrise. The medieval world ran on daylight because candles were expensive, torches were a fire hazard, and nobody wanted to burn through precious light. Early to bed, early to rise, not a choice, just how it worked. By the time the first grey light filters through those narrow arrow-slit windows, those tiny vertical gaps in the stone walls, designed to let archers shoot out while keeping arrows from coming in, the castle is already buzzing. Kitchen staff has been up since before dawn, stoking the massive hearth fires. Servants are hauling water from the courtyard well. Stable hands are tending to horses. Guards finishing the night watch are handing off their posts, pale-faced and red-eyed from a cold, sleepless night on the ramparts. Now here's the thing that surprises most people. Those massive stone walls that look so strong and impressive from the outside. Absolutely terrible at holding heat. Stone absorbs cold like a sponge. Thick walls, no insulation, tiny windows by design, all of that meant that on a cold morning in 1348, stepping into the Great Hall felt a little like stepping into a walk-in freezer. Does that give you chills just picturing it? Because it should. Breakfast, if you can call it that. Let's talk food, because medieval castle breakfast would not be making it onto any brunch menu today. For servants and workers, breakfast was fast and simple. A hunk of dark rye bread, maybe some pottage, which is basically a thick porridge made from whatever was on hand. Oats, barley, root vegetables, sometimes scraps of salted meat, washed down with ale. And before you raise an eyebrow, yes, ale in the morning, every morning, because the water in most places was genuinely not safe to drink. The fermentation process made ale far safer than plain water. You'd be sipping something mildly alcoholic before your first task of the day. As they used to say, better a foggy head than a sick belly. For the lord of the castle and his family, breakfast was a more formal affair, though still nothing like what we'd expect today. Cold meats from the night before, dried fruits, bread, maybe some cheese. Served on trenchers, thick slabs of day-old bread that doubled as plates. By the end of the meal, those soggy, sauce-soaked trenchers were tossed to the dogs or sent to the castle gate for beggars waiting outside. And in the year 1348, those morning briefings carried a new kind of dread. Because along with the household accounts, the lord received reports about what was happening beyond the walls. Which villages had gone quiet, which roads were too dangerous to travel, whether any merchant or traveler who'd passed through recently was now showing signs of sickness. The castle hierarchy. Everyone knew their place. Let's take a walk through the castle, because the social order inside those walls was as rigid and immovable as the stone itself. At the very top, the lord, or lady, in cases where a woman held the estate. Their chambers were in the most defensible part of the castle, usually the keep or main tower. Did they live in luxury? By medieval standards, absolutely. By ours, not quite. Their beds had thick curtains hanging around all four sides, not for privacy, but to trap body heat. Those curtains essentially created a small fabric tent around the sleeping area. Without them, you'd be waking up to your own breath visible as mist in the air. That's how cold it got. Here's a detail that most people don't know. The personal servants who slept nearest to the lord and lady, chamber attendants, body servants, actually slept on the floor of the bedchamber or just outside the door. Not because they had nowhere else to go, but because their body heat helped keep the room a few degrees warmer. Human beings used as living space heaters. How's that for a job description? Below the lord's inner circle came the knights and men-at-arms, sleeping in the great hall or in barracks along the inner walls. Tough, trained, used to discomfort. But even the most seasoned knight would admit that spending a January night in partial armor on a stone floor was nobody's idea of a good time. Then came servants, craftspeople, stable workers, each with their own rank, their own duties, their own place in the pecking order. Every single person in that castle knew exactly who they answered to, what they were responsible for, and what happened if they fell short. The Great Hall, the heart of everything. By mid-morning, the Great Hall was the beating heart of the castle. This enormous, high-ceilinged room, with its stone floors and bare walls, was where most of daily life played out. Meals, court sessions, disputes, celebrations, everything. The hearth was massive. We're talking a fireplace big enough to roast an entire ox, which, by the way, they did regularly. It burned continuously, fed by logs that servants dragged in from the wood stores. The heat it produced was real, but wildly uneven. Stand within 5 feet of that fire and you'd be uncomfortably warm. Move 10 feet away and the cold radiating off the stone walls would remind you exactly where you were. The lord held court here, hearing disputes from tenants, managing the estate, receiving messengers. And in 1348, those court sessions had an extra layer of anxiety running through them. Because the questions weren't just about land boundaries and harvest yields anymore, they were about fear. Which travelers had come through from infected regions? Which merchants could be trusted? Who among the household staff had been in contact with the outside world? People were scared, and scared people in positions of power sometimes make decisions that history doesn't look back on fondly. Some lords sealed off sections of the castle and left anyone showing symptoms inside trapped. Others expelled sick servants with nothing, sending them out into a countryside already in chaos. Harsh? Yes. But understand what they were working with. Nobody in 1348 knew what caused the Black Death. No concept of bacteria, no understanding of how disease spread. They saw people get sick and die, fast and terribly, and their instinct was to create distance. It's hard to judge people too harshly when they're operating in complete darkness about the most terrifying thing they've ever encountered. Doesn't that make you think about how we'd react today if we faced something we truly didn't understand? Midday, the main meal and the sound of work. By noon, every corner of the castle was alive with sound and motion. In the kitchens, which were often a separate building from the main keep to reduce fire risk, the main meal of the day was in full production. In medieval times, dinner was served around midday, not in the evening. And for a busy castle, feeding the entire household was a serious operation. A lord's household might feed anywhere from 50 to several hundred people daily, counting staff, visiting knights, traveling clergy, merchants with business at the gate, and the lord's own family. The lord's table would see roasted meats, venison, pork, wild boar when hunting had been good, alongside spiced sauces, savory pies, stewed vegetables, and several kinds of bread. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves were expensive imports and deliberate status symbols. A generous use of spices at the table was essentially a medieval way of saying, "I've got serious money and I want everyone here to know it." The medieval version of pulling up in a brand new car. For everyone else, pottage, bread, salted fish, dried beans, solid, filling, unremarkable. Food that kept you moving through a long afternoon of hard labor. And always ale. On the high table, wine as well, imported from France or along the Rhine, stored in the cool castle cellars. But in 1348, even the communal act of sharing a meal carried new unease. People were slowly beginning to grasp, even without the science to explain it, that being close to sick individuals seemed to increase your chances of getting sick. Strangers at the gate were viewed with deep suspicion. Travelers were questioned before being allowed in. The castle, always a place of community and refuge, was becoming a fortress against something it couldn't see or fight. The afternoon, cold corridors, tapestries, and quiet prayers. After the midday meal, the castle settled into a slightly slower rhythm. Not rest, leisure barely existed for most people in the medieval world, but a different kind of activity. The lord might retire to his solar, a private sitting room positioned to catch the best natural light with a smaller, more manageable hearth. The word solar literally refers to the sun, because these rooms were designed around maximizing daylight. In a world where candles cost real money, a sunlit room in the afternoon was genuinely valuable. Knights drilled in the courtyard, keeping their skills sharp, maintaining weapons, running through formations. Their training was constant, because with the plague disrupting trade routes and creating desperate populations, banditry was on the rise all across Europe. Every lord knew his walls were only as reliable as the people defending them. In the chapel, the castle chaplain held afternoon prayers. And in 1348, the chapel was seeing heavy foot traffic. When people are terrified and have no rational explanation for what's happening around them, faith becomes the anchor they hold on to with both hands. The prayers were longer. The offerings were more generous. People were making all kinds of promises. The stone corridors running between different parts of the castle were cold, dim, and drafty in a way that you really have to experience to appreciate. Walking from the Great Hall to the kitchens, or from the keep down to the outer walls, meant passing through passages where the temperature dropped sharply and drafts found you from angles you didn't expect. That's why the walls were hung with tapestries. Beautiful, yes, but function came first. Tapestries were essentially the medieval version of insulation. They blocked cold air, reduced drafts, and made those stone passages marginally more survivable in January. The floors were covered in dried rushes, reeds or straw mixed with herbs, layered across the cold stone to provide a thin buffer between your feet and the floor. Fresh rushes smelled clean and herby. Old rushes that hadn't been changed in a while were a completely different experience. But the intent was the same: make the cold, hard environment as livable as possible by any means available. Evening falls, and the castle becomes a different place. As the light faded, the castle transformed. Torches were lit in their iron brackets along the corridors. The great hall hearth was stoked back to full intensity. The household gathered for supper, a lighter meal than dinner, but still a communal gathering. And this is when the real social life of the castle came alive. Because evening in the Great Hall wasn't just about food, it was about entertainment, community, stories. A lord might have a resident minstrel or hire traveling performers. There would be songs, riddles, accounts of famous battles, tales of legendary figures. The oral tradition was rich and vital in an era when most people couldn't read a single word. But in 1348, even those evenings had a shadow running through them. The news brought by messengers and travelers was increasingly grim. Towns to the north, then closer, then the next valley over, going silent. Trade disrupted, priests overwhelmed, gravediggers unable to keep up. People gathered around fires and told stories partly to entertain, but also to process what they were living through, to give shape to a fear that had no face. The ones who could find dark humor in it, and medieval people were remarkably good at dark humor, by the way, used laughter as armor. It wasn't denial, it was survival. The night watch, the loneliest post in the castle. As full darkness settled over the castle, the night watch took their posts on the outer walls and towers. This was arguably the hardest duty in the entire castle. Standing on an exposed stone parapet, wind cutting through even a heavy wool cloak, watching for threats that might never come. For hours on end, in the dead of a medieval winter. It tested a person's endurance in a way that most daytime challenges simply didn't. The guards had fire pots, small iron containers with burning coals to hold or place near their feet. They had their cloaks, their wool tunics, their determination. And they had the knowledge that if they abandoned their post, the consequences would be severe. In the year 1348, those guards on the walls weren't just watching for bandits or enemy forces. They were watching for something harder to define: desperation. Because in communities being torn apart by plague, the desperate became unpredictable. People willing to force their way into a castle for the perceived safety of its walls. People willing to do almost anything for food, for warmth, for a chance at survival. The walls of a castle had always been about keeping threats out. In 1348, the definition of threat had expanded in ways nobody had anticipated. Why you would pray for a blanket. So let's come all the way back to the title. Why would you specifically pray for a blanket on the coldest nights in a medieval castle? Because in 1348, a good, heavy, well-made blanket was not guaranteed, even inside castle walls. Blankets and bed coverings were made of wool, and quality varied enormously. A thick, tightly woven blanket made from good wool was genuinely life-changing on a cold winter night. It was also expensive. The servants and lower-ranking workers sleeping in the Great Hall or in the barracks had whatever they could get, sometimes good wool, sometimes thin, rough fabric that barely kept the chill at bay. Sleeping on a stone floor with inadequate covering in a January night in Northern Europe wasn't just uncomfortable, it was genuinely dangerous. Even for higher-ranking members of the household, the layers mattered enormously. The curtained beds of the lord and lady worked precisely because they trapped whatever heat the occupants generated. Add a heavy wool blanket or two, a fur-lined coverlet if the family was wealthy enough, perhaps a heated stone placed near the feet, and you had a fighting chance at a warm night. Remove those layers and you were facing hours of cold-induced sleeplessness, stiff joints, and a morning where getting out of bed felt like a genuine act of courage. And here's a small detail that perfectly captures what daily life in 1348 actually felt like. People didn't sleep in one long, unbroken stretch the way we do today. The concept of first sleep and second sleep was completely normal. People would fall asleep shortly after dark, wake naturally around midnight for an hour or two, sometimes to pray, sometimes to have a quiet conversation, sometimes simply to check on the household, and then sleep again until dawn. During that middle-of-the-night window, lying in the dark in a cold castle with the wind working its way through every gap in the stonework, a good blanket wasn't a comfort. It was everything. So yes, you would pray for a blanket, not as an expression of weakness or exaggeration, as a completely rational recognition that in a stone castle in 1348, warmth was one of the few things that truly stood between you and a very hard night. What 24 hours in 1348 actually teaches us? So what do we take away from all of this? Life in a medieval castle in 1348 was simultaneously more impressive and more brutal than most of us imagine. People were ingenious, they built extraordinary structures, organized complex social systems, developed sophisticated agriculture, art, music, and law. They were not primitive, they were not simple, but they were also operating without the basic tools we take for granted, without germ theory, without antibiotics, without central heating, without even a clear understanding of what was killing them. They faced a catastrophe of almost incomprehensible scale, and they did what humans always do. They kept going. They adapted. They found ways to stay warm, to stay fed, to stay connected to each other, even when the world outside the walls was falling apart. The Black Death killed somewhere between a third and half of Europe's population. It reshaped the continent's culture, economics, religion, and political structures in ways that echoed for centuries. And it did all of that while people inside their stone castles were praying, working, eating their pottage, sleeping in their curtained beds, and yes, pulling their blankets a little tighter against the cold. Next time you're lying in a warm bed on a cold night, maybe give that blanket a small moment of appreciation. People in 1348 would have understood completely why you did.